What's on your radar today, Robby?
The pandemic erased 2 decades of progress in math and reading. That was a headline last week, that sentence, from the New York Times. Now, this article went into great detail about how reading and math scores among school children have plummeted over the last 2 years. Reading scores for 9-year-olds declined more precipitously than at any point in the last 30 years. And the pandemic was the first time since the 1970s that math scores fell at all. So all kids were, whether they were disadvantaged or advantaged, whether white, black, or brown, all kids suffered, though of course kids that were already struggling, already on the margins, they were hit worst of all. I was taken aback by the scope and the magnitude of the decline, said Peggy Carr, who's commissioner of the National Center for Education Statistics. She said that in an interview with the New York Times.
New test results from the National Assessment of Education Progress show math and reading scores for 9-year-olds in the U.S. falling sharply between 2020 and 2022. The worst drop-off for reading since 1990, and the first ever decline for math.
That is very alarming. It's disturbing, but it's not surprising, keeping in mind a year and a half ago, over half of our schools were not open for full-time learning.
Students who were already struggling in school showed the most dramatic drop-off.
Some colleagues of mine estimate that amounts to about 9 months worth of instruction.
Martin West is a member of the board that oversees this test.
How long could it take these students to catch up?
In my view, it's going to take a number of years before students are able to make up this lost ground in full.
I have students that are coming into 4th grade that are performing 2 and 3 grade levels below where they should be.
Let's think about that headline one more time. The pandemic erased 2 decades of progress in math and reading. By the pandemic, we mean the coronavirus itself. Well, that's of course false. COVID is a respiratory disease. It does not, generally speaking, make you less good at reading or math. Some questions about long COVID-related brain fog aside. The disease didn't cause learning loss among kids. Our policy response to the pandemic did that. An entire generation is falling behind academically and socially, by the way, because the people in charge of our policies, they closed schools for months. In fact, schools were the most shut down sector of our society throughout the pandemic. Long after businesses had reopened, indoor dining had resumed, public transportation was up and running, sports games were back on. All through that, schools were still virtual. That was reality despite the fact that kids are the least affected members of society when it comes to the disease itself. Young people's COVID outcomes were far better than other groups. Yet you would have thought, from looking at the policy, where schools are closed but everything else is open, you would have thought kids were disproportionately likely to die of COVID. That's how backwards it was. The mainstream media is now waking up to the fact that this policy was wrong. It made no sense. And is starting to grill Democratic policymakers who supported it. Watch Senator Patty Murray field a question from CNN.
Was it a mistake to keep children home for school so long during the pandemic?
Dana, this was a decision of local school officials and our scientific experts trying to get their hands around a pandemic that was killing millions of Americans, to protect their children, to protect their staff, to protect their communities. I am proud that when Democrats got control a year and a half ago, Democrats voted for the American Rescue Plan that helped our kids get back into school safely, making sure that our schools had testing and supplies and ventilation and the ability to make sure their kids could be safe at school. And today, virtually every child is back in school. That is what I focused on, making sure that we were providing the resources to our schools so they could reopen safely. And that's what we have today. Yeah. Yes, we have an issue about kids being out of school. And I am very focused, Dana, on making sure that we help get our kids back to where they need to be.
But let's be clear. The only reason that some schools, many schools in Democratic-controlled municipalities were closed for longer than anything else is that when it comes to public schools, teachers' unions have incredible power to set the policy agenda, and teachers' unions supported keeping schools closed as long as possible. If it was up to teachers' union leadership, schools might still be closed. Randy Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, previously said she didn't want to reopen schools until we had reached something approaching zero COVID. She wanted to keep them closed forever, in other words. It may be hard for working families who want their kids in school to trust Democrats that they won't outsource pandemic education policy to people like Randy Weingarten, in part because Democrats continuously promise to support whatever teachers' unions want. They are the most powerful constituency, most powerful force in the Democratic Party. Here's Pennsylvania Senate candidate John Fetterman in January.
I'm not going to sit up here and pretend that I know exactly what's needed. I'm going to turn to you. If you send me to Washington, D.C., you'll be the first people that I'll call and want to sit down and meet with and find out what you need, what would be most helpful, how can we be most supportive, what are the resources you need? Because ultimately, you're the professionals. I'm not going to tell you how to do your job. You're going to tell me how I can do my job better to support all of you.
You know who he was talking to there? Teachers' unions. So that's my rant for the day on COVID policy and learning loss. And look, I pointed this out, and this came up in our discussion we had on your podcast, that whatever you think about these policies, it just cannot be defended that schools were closed longer than other things. If you compare them to other things, like I haven't even heard anyone really make an argument that makes any sense. Because even if you thought you wanted things to be closed, if you think, and the other guest you had on the podcast did think indoor dining should still be closed.
So I think that your argument and the argument people make about how schools are treated differently than other places where the risk of COVID spreading is much higher, frankly, like indoor dining, is a very strong point. And to the other guest, Walker Bragman's defense, his argument is also consistent, even if you think the implications of it are over the top, which is he sees danger in both places, and therefore his argument would say, well, shut down indoor dining, don't open schools. However, I had a couple of questions for you, because earlier, in your radar, you said, obviously the COVID itself doesn't cause learning loss. And I just have to vet the argument some people make, which is that the deaths, obviously, of children contribute to to learning loss. There are about 17,200 children deaths, which in the context of children deaths, because children obviously don't die as frequently as older people, was significant. It became a significant cause of death. Where it ranks exactly, I'm not sure. But that also, about 200,000 children lost one parent or a caregiver in the context of COVID, and that also contributes to learning loss when you're undergoing a tragedy. Now, I don't say that to minimize the reality of virtual learning and the effect that had on people's education, but are you open to the idea that it was a confluence of factors there at all?
Did you say 17,000?
Yeah, 17,200 was the number that came up.
I don't know if the last time I checked, and now it was before Delta and Omicron, the number was, I think, in the hundreds. So it would surprise me if it was 17,000. Maybe that was under 18-year-olds. I think it's hundreds.
Okay. I mean, you can dispute. I'm sorry. I'm trying to fight it again right now while you're talking. But regardless, the 200,000 number of parents who have died from COVID.
Yes, but it's the response to the disease, not the reason math and reading scores are substantially behind is because virtual education did not work for most kids, for many kids, right? I mean, is that really in contention?
But here's the problem, and I understand people's different feelings about the scale of this issue. But if it's World War II and kids are staying in bunkers and being sent out to the countryside to avoid bombings in London and all of these kinds of things, of course there is learning loss, but people accept it because the reality is that their risks are high. And I understand that in the context of COVID, the belief is that there was not a sincere investment in risk if you were opening up all of these other things and exposing people to other kinds of risks, and that children were bearing the brunt of this burden. But I do think that especially before vaccines were distributed, at the end of the spring of 2020 and the beginning of the fall semester of 2020, there was a legitimate concern about not just kids themselves succumbing to COVID or getting COVID or dying from COVID, but their behavior as vectors in the school system. And should we be completely indifferent to the idea that teachers should have to just get COVID in a world where they're not vaccinated and people were absolutely dying at significant numbers from COVID to keep schools open? What's the cost-benefit calculation
I thought they were essential workers. Weren't we told they were essential workers?
Does people being essential workers mean they have to march them into
but the educating
death?
People is essential. And, well, you could have had maybe older teachers are teaching virtually for kids whose parents do still want virtual education, because some parents did want virtual education out of fear, I would say largely misplaced, but not entirely misplaced, about kids. So you could have done that, and you could have had younger teachers teaching instead. You could have done something.
In the early days, the pre-vaccine days of COVID, young people were dying of COVID as well. And you can say that it was not as high numbers, but there was a significant amount of fear that was shared by a lot of people across the political spectrum. And I'm just concerned that there's a little bit of revisionist history being done here. Because look, how long on average were schools closed? Like, I know there are these outlier cases. I know that we're talking about DC having this vaccine mandate in a way that's an outlier from the rest of the country. But at what point, are we talking about a period of time pre-vaccine where schools were closed because there were legitimate fears about teachers succumbing to the disease and parents being subjected to COVID because their kids were going to school, mixing with the general population and coming home with the virus?
I mean, you're right. For a lot of kids, schools weren't closed. If you were in, so I have nieces and nephews in Michigan, in the Detroit area, and those who were in a private school, Catholic school, they had school open the entire time. It might have been shut down in the beginning, in the spring, but by fall of 2020. They were in school the whole time. So what are we talking about? Because those schools are not under the influence of the teachers' unions, which is ultimately what I'm saying.
Because this has not been my issue. I'm genuinely asking, when on average do schools reopen?
I don't know when they reopen on average, but in many cities, which is what I'm talking about, they were still closing through the following winter. They were starting to reopen in some places, January, February, et cetera.
So that's my recollection of it as well, that as we got vaccines and the risks to adults from getting the virus were diminished significantly because of the vaccines, that schools reopened. And so part of me is confused about the focus of the
But my point being,
the closures being about kids' deaths. I understand that kids are much less vulnerable to COVID, but to me it was never about that. When I talked to my friends with children, the concern was parents get everything their kids get. Teachers stay sick nonstop because of how much they are with children and how kind of gross kids are, and that the concern was that adults were going to be vulnerable. In the same way that, and you probably disagree with these, but smoking bans and things like that were justified on the basis that employees who have to work in these places don't get to opt in and out of whether or not they're exposed to this carcinogen. And that's what we're talking about here. And you can say that you don't think that calibration was right, or that you think that it was inconsistent based on how restaurant closures went, or that schools should have opened a month earlier, 2 months earlier than they ultimately did. But it's hard for me to embrace an argument that teachers didn't have a legitimate concern with wanting to wait until they were able to get a vaccine before they put themselves back in a situation that exposed them to a deadly virus.
That was not, but that was not the level of that's not what the teachers' unions advocated, is what I'm saying. That if Randi Weingarten had gotten her way, even past the point of vaccination, she wanted cases to be the benchmark. She wanted there to be almost no cases in schools before schools reopened. And that would be a recipe for keeping schools closed forever. And that's why I'm reminding people that when Democrats say they're going to listen to the teachers' unions, as Fetterman just did there, you're setting yourself up, you could have been setting yourself up for school closing for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I take your point. It is interesting to me, though, that people have such great relationships with their teachers. Both my parents were teachers when I was growing up. I have friends in my life who are teachers, and people who in my life also who have kids, they are so appreciative of the ways in which their kid, the teachers are the ones that spend more time with their kids every day than they do. The teachers are the ones that are woefully underpaid in this country and that are reaching into their own pocketbooks so often to provide materials for the classroom and have a personal commitment in the health and well-being of the students. And it is a little confusing to me for that relationship to be characterized so differently than people's lived experience of that relationship just because of this issue of COVID. And I think a lot of teachers are also concerned about learning loss. It seems a little odd to be talking about it as that the teachers who have to teach to grade level and often are faced with consequences for not keeping up with grade level metrics are somehow indifferent to all of this. But I really do think people can make mistakes and have misfire in terms of the calculation, the risk-benefit calculation of keeping schools closed. But I really do think the arguments that were made, at least before vaccines were disseminated and available, are not as strong. And I would like to drill down a little bit more, I think, going forward into the timing of the school openings and whether or not there was a significant push by teachers' unions or other forces to keep schools closed beyond the point at which teachers were largely protected from the worst outcomes of COVID.
I appreciate your feedback, as always. Up next, we'll discuss what Britain's new prime minister means for U.S. and global foreign policy. Stay tuned.